of you here and to hear the vibrancy of this audience. It matches the vibrancy of the program that we have to offer today. I'm Janet Jacobson. I am professor of WGSS and this year co-director with Premilla Nadasen of the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Yeah, this is for BCRW. You can clap a lot. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to the 49th, 49, Scholar and Feminist Conference, Anti-Colonialism, Black Radicalism, and Transnational Feminism. Yes, it's amazing. And my first order of business actually is to invite you back a year from now for the 50th Scholar and Feminist Conference. We will, in the next academic year, in both the fall and the spring, be focusing on academic freedom and its implications for feminist liberation and intersectional politics and all of the topics that we're talking about today. So I invite you to participate with us in the coming year as well as we celebrate 50 years of Scholar and Feminist Conferences. Before we continue on with the program, I would like to acknowledge that the land on which this campus was built is part of the traditional and unceded territory of the Lenape people of the Delaware Nation. The Lenape were displaced from their homelands to places as far as what is now Oklahoma, Wisconsin, and Ontario, Canada. We pay respect to Indigenous peoples past and present and future, and uplift their continuing presence on their homelands. We also acknowledge the legacy of forced displacement and enslavement of African peoples. We understand that our existence on this campus today, using the resources of this institution, has been enabled by a history of both land and labor extraction. And that's some of what we will talk about, in fact, as the next day and a half goes on. This event itself, the 49th Scholar and Feminist Conference, is a collaborative event. So I have many thank yous for the collaborations, the solidarity, if you will, that made this possible. First, a number of just thank yous for the people who directly worked on the conference who made this possible. The wonderful, close to my heart, BCRW staff, Hope Dector, Sandra Mayano, Aritza, Olivia Cummings, Pamela Phillips, Sophie Kreitzberg, and Kelsey Kitsky, as well as our student research assistants, Sophia Bartley, Ramya Arumili, Ash Lewis, Kristen Santarin, Sabrina Bond, and Mariam Osman. Yes. Again, clapping welcome. I want to thank our American Sign Language interpreters, Candace Davider and Christine Quinton. Quinton? Yeah, Quinton, all right. She will have it correct in American Sign Language. And they're from Body Language Productions. For video, we have Matt Harvey, who, if you've watched any of the BCRW videos, the chances are you've seen Matt Harvey's work. And there are also parts of Barnard that have made this possible that we work with frequently, to whom we are very grateful. That includes events management, AV services, and facilities services, and Chartwell's catering. And Word Up Books is also a frequent collaborator and supporter of our events. Then I want to thank our major co-sponsor for this event, which is the Center for the Study of Social Difference at Columbia University. The relationship between Barnard and Columbia is variously fraught. But at BCRW, we have the truly good fortune to work with a collaborative counterpart in CSSD in mutually supportive relationship. The current director of CSSD, Lila Bulugode, is here. And Lila has been part of many BCRW programs and also supported our work. This conference comes out of a project beginning in 2019 that was funded by the CSSD, and we are very grateful for their support, for the ability to have the kind of intellectual conversations that make this ongoing conversation possible. So thank you to CSSD. And then third, I want to say thank you, and then I'll introduce our moderator, who is also Premilla Nadasen, to Premilla, who has been my collaborative partner as co-director for the past 2 years. It has been just such a pleasure to work with Premilla as a partner and with all the wonderful BCRW staff. Premilla, being Premilla, she gave me an assignment for today. For those of you who know her, you'll understand, which was to speak about the history of transnational work at BCRW. And I promise, do that tomorrow morning in the morning welcome. But today, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to break a few of the rules and talk about history itself, which is, in fact, part of the focus of this afternoon's panel on Marxism and transnational feminist liberation. We will hear from a number of historians. But just as importantly, I want to talk about the ways in which working with Premilla has influenced my thinking, which is that I now run around and talk about history all the time. So I work on contemporary American politics, and the idea that many of my colleagues who are in religious studies, so they study thousands of years of history, and I go back to, maybe 1945, and they make fun of this. But in fact, I have come in these 2 years to a new appreciation of the import of history, not just in knowing your history, as my colleagues are always reminding me, but also as a resource of possibility, a resource for the present, a resource for the future, and a way of rethinking the relationship among past, present, and future. You've been truly influenced when you start to sound like someone. And so I want to talk about just briefly the ways in which Premilla's influence has made me understand the history of Black transnational feminism, the history of BCRW. I've worked at BCRW since 2000. And yet in this past year, especially as we have done a self-study and external review, and in conversation with the staff and with Premilla and with the advisory board, I have come to see the history of what we have done at BCRW in a new way. That the website, which we really started building up in the early 2000s, is a resource for the present. And this program will be live streamed and will be available for you as part of that resource as we go forward. But most importantly, and this is something that I learned in conversations even earlier today, what that resource of history is a resource of relationality, of possibility for solidarity, and of work together. So it is my great pleasure to say thank you to Premilla Nadasen, and also to introduce her as the moderator of this particular panel. Professor Nadasen is the Anne Whitney Olin Professor of History here at Barnard College. I'm trying to look it up officially, but I can't, so I'll just say it from memory. She's won many prizes, including the inaugural prize in honor of Anne Snitow, which is another way of understanding how we think about history and our relation to those who have gone on before us. And she's written many important books, including Welfare Warriors, and most recently, and if you come back in a few weeks, you'll be able to hear about CARE, the last stage of capitalism. Yes, which this panel will explain why it's going to be the last one. So without further ado, I ask both Premilla and the panelists to come up so that we can hear from them.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see all of you here. I'm just really thrilled that we have organized this conference with the help of BCRW. I want to start off by saying, first of all, thanks to the staff at BCRW, to Janet, and to CSSD for all their support in helping us put this conference together. As Janet mentioned, this came out of a project that started in 2018 on Black transnational feminisms that was started by me and Celia Naylor, who is here somewhere. There she is, Celia Naylor in the back. And we co-directed this project for 4 years, from 2019 to 2023. And then last year, Tammy Navarro and I became co-directors together, and Tammy was really crucial in helping put this conference together. And I do want to say a little word about history. I'll talk a little bit more about this tomorrow at the opening as well, but part of the reason we decided to organize a working group on Black transnational feminism is in part because of what we saw as a little bit of a disciplinary divide between women's and gender studies and history. There's a lot of historians on this panel today. And that is there were two separate conversations that were happening. Within history, there's a lot of work about the transnational Black feminist work from the 1930s to the 1940s to the 1950s, and you'll hear a little bit about that today. There was a different narrative in WGSS around the emergence of transnational feminism in the 1980s and the 1990s. So part of what we were trying to do is to bring those two discourses together and to think about how they were in fact connected to one another. But anyway, that's part of what we'll be talking about in the next day and a half, and we invite you all to join us and to be a part of that conversation. I do want to say that Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor was supposed to be here on the stage with us today, and unfortunately got sick yesterday and had to have some urgent care. She's okay, but could not be here with us today. And there were a couple other people as well, and we'll talk about that tomorrow. We're supposed to be on the panel tomorrow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce our panelists, and they each are going to have about 10 minutes to speak. And if you know me, I'm going to try to keep them on schedule. But I think this is a very hard group to discipline. I will do my best because I have some questions at the end. I don't even know what they're going to say yet, but I'm sure I'll have questions. And I'm not going to give their full bios, which are in the program and which are on the website, so I encourage you to look at those. Dr. Charisse Burden-Stelly is Associate Professor of African American Studies at Wayne State University. And I'm just going to mention her most important book. Well, they're all important, but Black Scare, Red Scare, Theorizing Capitalist Racism in the United States. And I'm also going to say she's a member of the Black Alliance for Peace and Community Movement Builders, okay? And I think that's important because all of our panelists today are also both theorists as well as activists. Professor Dayo Gore is an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at Georgetown University. And she's the author of Radicalism at the Crossroads, African American Women Activists in the Cold War. And she is currently completing a book manuscript on Black women's radical transnational politics and travels in the long 20th century. And she's also one of the key organizers and leaders of Scholars for Social Justice, a really important political organizations for scholars and activists that I encourage you to look up and join. And Robyn Spencer-Antoine is a professor at Wayne State University. She is the author of The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland. And she is currently working on biographies of both Angela Davis and Patricia Murphy Robinson, and has created the PAT archives on Instagram to spotlight the ways that the items in Black left theorist Pat Robinson's unprocessed home archives reframes the Black radical tradition. So with that, I will hand it over to Charisse first.
Hi. Okay. So I have a very long paper, and I thought we would get more time because Keeanga's not here. However, Premilla has said we do not get extra time. So I'll just sort of talk through some of the ideas. So I opened comparing the analysis between 1970 and 1975 of the Third World Women's Alliance, an organization focused on building sisterhood by connecting third world socialist and feminist struggle. An analysis that they had in a pamphlet called Black Women's Manifesto about triple oppression. So my paper is about triple oppression, capitalist racism, and imperialism. And so part of what they argue is that Black women are oppressed based on their relationship to the capitalist mode of production. It also, triple oppression also describes how they're oriented in the Black family, not least because of the ways that they have to work in white people's homes, which creates particular narratives around their own orientation to their family can create interpersonal conflict between Black women and Black men. They talk about how Black women are a source of cheap, highly exploitable, and also degraded labor. And I go on to argue that this theorizing has its antecedents in what I call in my book, Black Scare, Red Scare, the Black Scare, Red Scare longue durée, which spans roughly World War I and the early Cold War. So I talk about how Louise Thompson employed triple oppression to explain that Black women's oppressive relationship to the mode of production was based on their race, sex, and subordination in the labor market. You have Black militants like Marvell Cook and Ella Baker, who published an article titled The Bronx Slave Market, in which they studied super exploitation as related to Black domestic workers. They explained how racialized womanhood and structural poverty that was deeply intensified by the Great Depression forced Black women to sell their labor in these open air slave markets for very abysmal wages. And here their labor exploitation was gendered insofar as domestic work was conventional women's work. It was racialized insofar as Blackness fitted them for low wage, unprotected contingent labor. And so we can see resonances in the analysis of the Third World Women's Alliance, specifically Fran Beal, and sorry, what was I talking about? Maxine Williams. I was going to say Michelle Williams. And then the work of Cook and Baker and Louise Thompson Patterson. And so the important part is this analysis of triple oppression emanates from internationalist, anti-imperialist, and anti-capitalist praxis that connects the struggles of Black women in the United States to those in the global South. For example, in July 1930, the communist Juliana Burroughs connected the working conditions of Black women suffering under imperialism through their propensity for domestic work, forced labor, expropriation of land, living conditions, death rates, child labor, education, and neglect of Black women by organized labor, and the link that connected Black women in the United States, Black women on the African continent, Black women in the Caribbean, and as well as migrant women was, she argued, was imperialism. And so she said, quote, "Our task in the revolutionary trade unions are to lead these struggles of the masses and direct them into the stream of world revolt, to put up a program of immediate demands and organize them into workers and peasant unions. We must put up a determined fight for their rights as a national group fighting for their self-determination," end quote. And these women who theorized triple oppression also often connected Black women's relationship to the capitalist mode of production and oppression under imperialism to eradicating fascism and to fighting war. So somebody like Claudia Jones made this argument, as well as Tyra Edwards. So I have a book called, an edited volume called Organized Fight, When Black Communist Women's Political Writing. Many of the women in that volume theorized triple oppression, and their politics included not only proletarian revolution or the structural transformation that would allow for Black women to have a more egalitarian position in society, but they also were deeply concerned about how fascism could be understood through the conditions specifically of Black women in the South. And they also were very, very concerned about war, especially how Black mothers were affected by war, not least because their sons and fathers and other family members were cannon fodder for imperialist war. How much time do I have? 5 minutes? Okay, good. So let's see what else. So in U.S. capitalist racist society, which is a term that I talk about in my work, Black women's labor was kept cheap, onerous, and easy to control. This could be added the hyper extraction of their reproductive labor and accompanying social oppression through concentration in domestic service. Thus, here we can see that historically capitalism and imperialism were Black women's worst enemies because it transformed them into a class of laborers that was economically profitable to exploit and oppress and socially acceptable to degrade and disrespect. Black women represented a cheap and surplus labor supply in the market and a free labor supply in their own homes, and often in the homes of white people. Likewise, the industries employing Black women were some of the most super exploitative across the country. This included domestic work, hospital work, factory work, farm labor, and garment workers. Black women were also overrepresented in the laundry industry, which was one of the worst industries one could work in. And in fact, thinking about, so there's many ways that Black women's labor reveals a lot about later labor struggles. So for example, the laundry was one place where speed up was really prevalent. And speed up, of course, was something that was highly focused on by the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, for example. Focusing on Black women's labor, especially domestic labor, gives us insight into, I think, organizing or the struggles of organizing like gig work or contingent labor today, because part of what Black women did, Black women domestic workers did, was they really transformed who counts as a worker, what counts as labor, who are the historical subjects of proletarian revolution, and what it actually takes to unionize the majority of the working class, because globally, the majority of the working class is not white male factory workers. And so in this way, to paraphrase Fanon, Black women stretched Marxism, not only when it came to the colonial question, but also when it came to the question of African descended women. And this is really important because I think, and this is something I think we'll talk about a little bit later, what sets Black women theorists of triple oppression apart, I think, from other Black feminists is that triple oppression is objectively anti-imperialist, it's objectively anti-capitalist and internationalist, and not all Black feminism isn't that, right? I think that if we make that conflation, then we end up putting Beyonce in the same political genealogy as Claudia Jones, and I think that that's a mistake. And so triple oppression is a really important analytical framework because it maps out material relationships, but also gives keen insight into what is to be done. It also expands the cartography of struggle because it is internationalist and because it's looking at labor exploitation, not only in the United States, but throughout the Black world, so to speak. And I think that what's also important is that Black women's triple oppression, it's something that cuts across class, right? So even as super exploitation accrues differently around differently classed bodies, we can even see that Black women who are in the professions often have service-based labor or caretaking type of work, and this emanates, I think, from their what I call their structural location or this triple oppression. So, for example, we have Black women in DEI contemporarily who bear the brunt of these white supremacist assaults and are the last hired and first fired, even in this form of professionalized work. And so I think if we can see the cumulative effects of this historical reality of Black women's triple oppression. And the last thing that I'll say, just in the interest of time, is that all of these women who are theorizing triple oppression, they're in organizations, right? They're in organizations, they're institution builders. They are working for, or they are advocates of mass struggle, and they are critical not only of the white ruling class, but also of the Black petty bourgeoisie and the Black bourgeoisie, and those who are keenly invested in the oppression, suppression, and repression of the Black working class, particularly, but the colonized and imperialized working class writ large. And so I think holding on to the analytic of triple oppression, even as we update it to our current historical and material realities, is really important because, again, it puts at the forefront an anti-imperialist, anti-capitalist, specifically socialist analysis, as well as demands a particular type of organizing for liberation.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry, I try to not print out my papers and I can't both hold a microphone and scroll and read at the same time. But maybe I should practice a little more. Thank you all for coming out this afternoon, this evening, and particularly I want to thank Scholar and Feminist and Premilla and Janet for organizing this event and inviting me. It's an honor to be here. To think through some of these questions, particularly as I try to finish this book that is never ending, but will end at some point. I'm going to read my paper, and I'm going to tell you, it might go a little over, but I didn't include slides because I knew slides would send me more overtime, because then I would want to talk about the pictures and things like that. So I'm trying to discipline myself a little bit here. All right, so we'll go. 1, Bueller Richardson and genocide. In 1951, artist activist Bueller Richardson penned the starkly titled poem, Genocide. Scripted in 3 parts, in the central voice of a Negro woman, accompanied by a chorus of 10 children from the ages 3 to 21, the piece begins in a, quote, urgent and angry mood, and reads in part, look at me, this furrowed brow, these scarred hands, gaunt body, these bursting veins, these are the lines of pain, ancient pain, chorus, 333 years old. Angry pain because of that, chorus, 333 years. And my pain is unended, for this government's policy towards me is ever changing but unchanged, unpaid. 200 years of my unpaid labor made this country the nation it is now. Since then, through deceit, gradualism, hypocrisy, another 100 years of semi-slavery. This government's policy towards me is unchanged. And in my deepest plight, seeing that they would export this American way of life across the ocean and seas, must cry out, beware. Look at me. I am the living, indisputable fact of American democracy. I am the Constitution unamended. I am the citizen undefended. Chorus, humiliated, insulted, betrayed, and outraged. You must see that I am Black, and because of that, a strange democracy has been practiced upon me. Chorus, say it plain. It kills me. By government policy, I am slain, maimed, slaughtered, lynched, framed. It kills me, this American democracy. It kills me. Richardson's performance of this searing piece coincided with the 1951 publication of the We Charge Genocide, the historic petition to the United Nations for relief from a crime of the United States government against the Negro people. The petition was issued by the Civil Rights Congress, or the CRC, under the leadership of longstanding communist William Patterson, and with significant contributions from a committed group of Black women radicals who did much of the on-the-ground research and organizing that informed and publicized the petition. As Richardson announces in the poem, when she states, seeing that they would export this American way of life across the ocean and seas must cry out. For these Black women radicals, the genocide petition provided an avenue for their internationalist vision and politics to take shape through US-based organizing during the years after World War II. Yet it was not the first such petition to the UN that Black women leftists helped to formulate and publicize. These women were also central in producing the National Negro Congress, or the NNC's 1946 petition to the UN, one of the first issued on the behalf of African Americans. In my brief talk today, you see I said brief, I want to discuss the Black feminists in practice, if not name, radical internationalist vision and activism of Thelma Dale and the dynamic group of Black women who coalesced in the National Negro Congress under her leadership and continued with their internationalist organizing as contributors and staff in the successor organization, the Civil Rights Congress. This group included a number of Black women who worked alongside Thelma Dale in the Congress championing Black liberation and Black women's leadership, as well as figures such as Heloise Moorhead, Yvonne Gregory, and Maud White Katz, who were all active in the National Negro Congress and also worked in the CRC on legal lynching cases and the genocide publication. This work marked a particularly significant moment for these Communist Party-affiliated Black women, as the global stage offered a vibrant site for their activism. In addition to the founding of the United Nations, from 1945 on, many communist and anti-colonial activists came together in world conferences and political gatherings to deepen their investments in and understanding of the links between Black liberation, women's equality, anti-capitalism, and national liberation struggles in the global South. Involvement in this work allowed Black women radicals to reclaim some of the leadership status they had lost at the end of World War II. It also helped them to consolidate a Black feminist international politics, which did a number of things. It framed the struggle of Black liberation in the US as deeply interconnected with the anti-colonial struggles of racialized people in the global South. It fought to center the insights and lived experiences of Black women. and as Richardson's poem and Dale's leadership demonstrate, reimagined what bodies could speak to the experiences of Black oppression and resistance on the global stage. It also, I want to suggest, presents a less linear history of both resistance and oppression as captured in Richardson's repeated refrain, changing but unchanged. 2, Thelma Dale and the National Negro Congress. As a member of the Communist Party USA, Dale's investment in party politics and political line often took a backseat to the work for Black liberation. Quote, "I read what I had to read," Dale noted in reflecting on Marxist theorizing, "but that wasn't really what attracted my attention. More the right people. They, the Communist Party, played a major role in all of that," unquote. In December 1943, Dale joined the National Negro Congress as an administrative secretary to work with, quote, "the right people," such as Executive Secretary Ed Strong. Both Strong and Dale had worked together as activists in the Southern Negro Youth Congress and agreed as Dale joined the Congress to build the NNC or bury it, unquote. However, by 1944, Dale faced the difficult challenge of leading this national organization on her own as Strong left to join the war effort. Writing to her staff while visiting NNC city chapters, Dale shared her encounters with many progressives who, quote, "seemed to raise their eyebrows on learning that the National Negro Congress was, quote, not filling Ed Strong's job, but we skirts are trying to hold down the fort," unquote. Sarcastically noting the sexism embedded in such responses, Dale dismissed them as, quote, "just a bit of male chauvinism hanging on." Reflecting later on her efforts to raise the issue of Black women's equality in the NNC and the CP more broadly, Dale asserted, quote, "It is not because of any feelings of dissatisfaction with our work that made me raise the question of the role of Negro women. It was raised by me because I felt that politically there was lack of understanding the woman question in general and Negro women in particular," unquote. As Dale's writings indicate, she articulated Black feminist politics throughout her tenure as executive secretary, or acting executive secretary as they sometimes named her. This emerged most notably in the number of Black women activists who served as office staff, contributed to committees, and worked on the Congress View magazine. Staff members included Ruth Jett, who had worked in a range of CP-affiliated organizations, including the Council of African Affairs, and was a delegate to the 1943 Western Hemisphere Youth for Victory Conference in Mexico City. Dorothy K. Funn, who worked closely with Dale leading key organizing projects for the Congress, including heading the UN petition campaign, and activists Yvonne Gregory and Heloise Moorhead, who both worked on the Congress View magazine and later with the CRC. The Congress also relied on CP-affiliated Black women leftists, often friends and comrades of Dale, such as Maud White Katz, Marvel Cook, and Vicki Bess Garvin, who all served on various committees. It was this expansive network of Black women activists who worked alongside Dale to fuel the Congress's emerging Black internationalist politics. Such politics were visible on the front page of the April 1943 issue of the Congress View. The cover story publicized the Congress's upcoming conference under the theme, quote, "Manpower, Democratic Rights, a People's Victory, a People's Peace," unquote. And they argued that under this theme, they would address this theme with the, quote, "full realization that the problem of Negroes are intimately connected with those of colonial people of the world and their struggles for liberation," unquote. A September 1945 correspondence from Ed Strong, who was overseas at the time, reinforced these politics as he urged Dale to ensure that the, quote, "Congress give its attention to the immediate mobilization of the 14 million Negro people to give active support to the African workers and the uprisings of French Indo, China, and Indonesia," unquote. Under Dale's leadership, the NNC had become uniquely poised to link anti-colonial struggles to their work for Black liberation in the US. Dorothy Funn encapsulated this analysis in a Congress press release where she asserted, quote, "The Negro people of America are the victims of the same forces who are today attempting to enslave the colonial people. Those forces who would see China weakened by internal strife, starving, and backwards caused by our imperialist policies would also deny a living wage to the American worker." And you can see the resonance with some of the points that Charisse was making earlier. 4, the National Negro Congress petition. It was with this internationalist vision in mind and the founding of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in 1946 that the NNC decided to compile, quote, a petition to the United Nations on behalf of 13 million oppressed Negro citizens of the United States of America. For Thelma Dale, taking this bold step must have felt bittersweet as these efforts coincided with the post-war restructuring of the NNC as an organization that included Dale being demoted, like many women workers in the post-war, from her leadership position. The new leadership structure, which included Max Yergin as president, labor activist Revel Caton as the new executive director, Dale as an executive staff alongside a recently returned Strong, and Dorothy Fund as legislative director. This leadership and key Congress members drafted the initial framework for the brief pamphlet petition to which CP members and historian Herbert Apotheker contributed an 8-page supplement titled The Oppression of the American Negro, The Facts. The petition garnered immediate national and international attention, and over 20 US-based organizations, including the NAACP, sent letters of support. We charge genocide. I cut something. That was the pause. Building directly on the insights, Premilla is powerful, even though I was trying to resist. Power was strong. We charge genocide. Building directly on the insights, strategies, and personnel the National Negro Congress used in launching its petition campaign, in December 1951, the CRC presented We Charge Genocide to the United Nations, emphasizing the UN's definition of genocide as, quote, acts committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, racial, ethnical, or religious group. The over 200-page publication, which the NAC petition was only 13 pages. This one was 200 pages. This 200-page publication painstakingly documented a long history of racial discrimination, economic exploitation, and violence against African Americans. It framed this as the, quote, willful creation of conditions making for premature death, poverty, and disease, unquote, that constituted, quote, crimes of federal, state, and municipal governments in the United States against 15 million of its own nationals, the Negro people. Extensive sections of the petitions relied on writings and activism of Black women affiliated with and or on the CRC staff who had traveled to sites of legal lynchings, policing, and racial violence, and sites where discrimination against African Americans occurred, often in the South, to investigate, speak firsthand with family who were often wives and mothers, and publish accounts of the incidents. Thinking through the history of the the history of the National Negro Congress and CRC's petitions, campaigns on behalf of the Black people in the US, illustrates the role of the US Black left, particularly the National Negro Congress, in deploying the United Nations as a strategic tool in Black internationalist politics. It also makes visible the crucial contributions of Black women radicals to this work and as their feminist politics inserted a gendered analysis and space for Black women's lived experience within the Black internationalist organizing. They also offered early iterations of what would later be known as Third World Solidarity politics, which linked the struggles of third world countries abroad with the plight of Black and brown people, Black and brown oppressed communities, or third world peoples living in the US. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm so pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you about my work on giving bottom-up views on Black radical internationalism, Black left feminism. I want to say that it's an honor to be here. The woman that I'm talking about in this first part of the paper, Pat Robinson, actually spoke at the Barnard Conference on Sexuality, the 9th such conference here on April 24th, 1982. So it feels very historic to be talking about her in this space all these many years later. My paper is 10 minutes long. I've known Premilla for over 35 years. Clearly we met at birth. And so I stick to the plan. Okay. Onward to the World Revolution, Black left feminists against the US war in Vietnam. In September 1968, a collective that defined themselves as Poor Black Women of Mount Vernon penned an open letter to Vietnamese women guerrilla fighters. The letter provided an historical overview of Black history in an international context and decried the role of capitalism, the Black middle class, racist white feminists, and patriarchal men, arguing that poor Black women occupied the lowest rung in the socioeconomic ladder. It spoke from what they called the belly of the monster and professed unity with, quote, all of the oppressed throughout the world. It boldly stated, "We have come to join them in the struggle for a new world and a new people." The letter was signed "Onward to the World Revolution." This political missive, reprinted in Tony Cade's Bambara, The Black Woman, provides one window into the connections between Black women's activism and the movement against the US war in Vietnam. These women were not an anomaly. Black women played a central role in the movement against the US war in Vietnam as activists, theorists, writers, and polemicists. There were many women who individually and collectively brought anti-war agitation into the grassroots organizations they worked with. Anti-Vietnam War activism was a bridge that linked these women across various movements, geographies, and chronologies. Centralizing their activism transforms understanding of what the anti-war movement looked like, who participated, when, and where. Their history unseats the assumption that Black women were largely absent in anti-Vietnam War agitation unless they were in SNCC or the Black Panther Party or majority white organizations like Women's Strike for Peace or the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, or part of the Communist Party or organized left. Yet these women were Marxists, influenced by Fanon, Che, and others. Using insights from Black women's studies, intellectual history, social history, and US and the world, these women's presence in the movements of their own creation can be seen. As they sought to challenge poverty, sexism, and racism at home, they sought common cause with activists in the third world that they perceived to be engaged in similar struggles for self-determination. They connected their domestic resistance to anti-colonial Mau Mau uprising in Kenya, the Bandung Conference, the Cuban Revolution, and the US invasion of Santo Domingo, as well as the second wave of African independence movements in the 1960s. So I want to start with Patricia Murphy Robinson. Patricia Murphy Robinson's trajectory exemplifies the complex and sometimes contradictory intersections between Black left feminism and anti-war activism. Robinson was the leading figure behind Black Women Enraged, an organization that was created in the wake of Malcolm X's assassination that would spearhead anti-war protests in New York. BWE grew out of Robinson's organizing with the poor women that she met while working as a social worker and psychotherapist in New Rochelle and White Plains. Scholar Rosalind Baxendale summarized the group's early activities, noting that Robinson started the group in 1960 to address teenage pregnancy, and the group attracted Black women ranging from grandmothers to teenagers, including domestic workers, factory workers, and welfare recipients. Their meetings became a place for intense intergenerational discussion as solo parenting realities and the inability to afford childcare meant that women brought their children to the meeting. It's clear that these women's sessions together were a type of radical alternative education. One might call them a salon, rap sessions, or consciousness raising. These sessions buttressed them as they spearheaded many political initiatives. They would write together, penning collective treatises, which joined the critique of capitalism and a sense of women's rights, coupled with this global awareness. Their work overlapped and dovetailed with welfare organizing work, tenant organizing, and running a freedom school. Black Women Enraged was one umbrella for their work. They embraced socialist feminism, led by Robinson, who would become a leading voice in the feminist movement. They used literature, they used rhetoric that suggested a masculinist orientation, arguing that Black men as soldiers where manhood would be imperiled by their participation in the war effort, speaking as mothers, as sisters, and as partners of soldiers. The juxtaposition of their rhetorical choices are provocative, especially given the shadow of the Moynihan Report and its prescription of patriarchal manhood and families. Manhood as a liberation trope was deployed in many different organizations and initiatives in this era. And here I can quote scholar Rhonda Williams, who suggested careful attention should be paid to how this may or may not facilitate the subordination of women and buttress patriarchal authority. This does not mean that male criticism of male chauvinism was off the table. The Black Women Enraged Collective would follow their foreign policy critiques into places historians may find unlikely as they took part in debates that cut to the heart of female self-determination, starting with birth control. BWE leader Patricia Robinson worked with Planned Parenthood at a time where the notion of birth control as genocide clashed with the growing demand by Black women and activists in the women's liberation movement for family planning and bodily autonomy in direct challenge to patriarchal ideas. They also challenged white feminist articulations of abortion access and choice. Robinson's group contributed a debate they've been involved in about birth control to Lilith, a Seattle-based feminist journal created in 1968. By doing so, they signaled the understanding of the larger implications of their debate to the women's movement, and they claimed the space as part of that movement. The women wrote an open letter that began with a critique of male infidelity, drug and alcohol use, and worship of their cars. They acknowledged that racism undergirded forced sterilization and birth control, but they emphasized that freedom and self-determination for women was paramount. For us, birth control is freedom to fight genocide of Black women and children. And they also noted that poor Black women in the US have to fight back out of our own experiences of oppression. It's worth noting that this letter was signed by women who defined themselves as welfare recipients, housewife, domestic mother, and grandmother, including Robinson, who was listed as a housewife and psychotherapist. In another article, Robinson analyzed capitalism as a system of white and male supremacy and positioned Black women at the bottom of the hierarchy. Her body exploited by white men, her labor expropriated by white women, and her child, which they call the surplus product of her body, also exploited. The archive on Black women enraged is elusive, yet Robinson is traceable as a visible member of this group. Her work can be found throughout different elements of the radical women's movement. In particular, she would continue to theorize Black women's liberation in ways that challenged the fundamental structures of US society and sought common cause with oppressed people around the world. Black Women Enraged's history suggests that for Black left feminists, Vietnam was not a single issue, but connected to broader ideals of justice, challenging male dominance, etc. And of course, Black feminists played pivotal roles in other anti-Vietnam organizations, such as African Americans Against the War in Vietnam, such as Black Resistance Against the War, the Mothers of Watts as well. And there were many who started their own organizations, such as the Berkeley-based Black Organization Against War and Racism, and Poor Women Against the Vietnam War, started by Harlem activist Kalia Clark. This brief survey suggests the need to broaden this concept of what anti-war activism looked like. These women organized against the war on their own terms. Their story is a larger story of alliances and nationwide groups and networks. However, the groups they formed and the ad hoc nature of them, which has made them elusive in the archives, also gave them flexibility and independence that allowed them the kind of mobility that other groups lacked, absent the ideological schisms that plagued the sectarian left and the women's movement, where splits were par for the course. Scholar Ashley Farmer has identified the difficulty in locating Black women in the archives as scholars and urged us to mind these chance encounters and passing mentions and sometimes random references. These women are difficult to find, but they were there. The presence of their bottom-up efforts helps to build a case for the centrality of anti-Vietnam War activism in the Black intellectual tradition and the larger Black freedom movement.
I'm not really that bad. It's all a bad rumor is what it is. Actually, part of the reason I wanted you guys to keep your comments to 10 minutes is because I think there is a lot that we can engage with one another on the stage and to dig a little deeper into your work. And I just want to start by saying how deeply influenced I have been by all of your research and all of your writing. I'm currently writing a book on Miriam Makeba, and as I am working on that, I keep going back to your work, the three of you, as well as a number of other people who are going to be here tomorrow, but to think through the meanings of transnational Black feminism, anti-colonialism, and Black radicalism. So thank you for that. I want to start with thinking about what it is about the Black woman's experience that opens up avenues to think about transnationalism and transnational solidarities and anti-colonialism. The connection, and I think it came out in all of your papers, the connections between the domestic and the transnational, between the globalized, between the working, the labor experiences of Black women in this country, the triple oppression that you mentioned, Charisse, and the global racialized gendered labor market, between the personal and the political, as you explained, Robyn. And are these inseparable in the lives of Black women? Robyn Kelley has written about the Black experience in the US as already transnational, that in fact you can't talk about the Black experience without talking about transnationalism and thinking about it in an international context. So I guess I'd like to put that out there. Is that true? Do we need the modifier transnational in front of Black feminism?
I can start. So I think that yes, we do need the modifier because not all people who engage in Black feminist politics are transnational or internationalist in scope. To say that we need to understand the international situation to understand Black people's realities is probably an objective fact, right? Because we have to understand capitalism and imperialism as constitutive of the capitalist world economy, which is an internationalist system. That does not mean that people's politics and organizing have that same focus. Again, I think, you see, we are in a battle of ideas, right? It's true, right? Because one might argue that Americans, USians, are one of the most highly propagandized populations in the world. And if that is the case, if it is that propaganda, the US state propaganda is meant to mystify and obfuscate, then our job is to demystify, clarify, and be precise. And so when we talk about these conceptual terms, it's important to have different types of modifiers because that clarifies what people's political stakes are, who they see themselves as accountable to, what they understand as what is to be done, as well as their analysis, right? And so I don't think there's anything wrong with not being transnational per se, but I think we have to be clear that they're just like there's a difference probably between nationalist feminists, cultural nationalist feminists, for example, and transnational feminists. I think that if we don't have those different modifiers, then again, we just lump all Black women who care about gender broadly into some undifferentiated intellectual or political tradition, which is not taking Black women's organizing, theorizing, and intellectual production seriously. We have 1,000 ways that we understand Hegel or Marx and all of these other thinkers. I think also we don't have to conflate, number one, all Black women who care about women's liberation as feminists, but also to say that, to have some undifferentiated understanding of Black feminism so that we can sort of try to maybe organize everybody or situate everybody as radical, or to ascribe a political project that may or may not necessarily be there. So to make a short story long, as I will do while I'm here, yes, we need modifiers like transnational feminism to have clarity about what we're talking about and what we're describing.
I wanted to add that for me, I'm interested in tracing sort of the theoretical paths. I'm interested in tracing how people get their ideas and what do they do when their ideas force them to move in a different way in the world. I feel like that in some ways is the heart of movement building. Just because you see something oppressive happening over here in the world, what makes you feel like you're part of it? You're implicated in it. You must do something about it. It speaks to you. It is part of you. I see that happening in this contemporary space around many global, issues that are on front page news or should be. And so I'm interested in thinking about that. And I think in order to do that, we have to understand the thought processes of these Black women leaders and how they challenge each other, what they're reading, how they're sharing what they're reading, those sorts of things. Charisse talked about Fanon and Black women sort of challenging Marx. How are they not just because they're Marxists or in these organizations doesn't mean that they're in lockstep with the ideas of these organizations. How are they refining these ideas and how are they challenging? And to me, that's sort of the heart and soul of trying to situate um, Black women as thinkers and challenging the things that we are taught to think and believe about Black women already the minute that you hear that it's the Black woman who's the subject of the conversation. So we have to kind of undo that. And by undoing that, we have to try to understand the thought processes, the intellectual genealogies, the work that these women did to dismantle their own mental conditioning sometimes around how to see the world or how to move in the world and what allowed them to do that. Because I think unless we need to know that in order to build movements, I think. And if we don't know that, then they just seem like amazing people. Like, wow, it was their family because they came from this family or because, they read this thing. But oftentimes it's a process because of the daily um, absorption, passive absorption of propaganda that is life in America.
I think for me, can you hear me? I think for me, the question really invokes the genealogy of Black feminism. If we're going to use modifiers, I think the modifier should be the other way around, right? That I think Black feminism, its genealogy speaks to a transnational, international politics, speaks to an understanding of class and gender and sexuality as interlocking or intersectional. Like I think the core text we draw, that we ought to acknowledge the ways in which the core figures or texts or intellectual pursuits that we see as the center of Black feminism carried these ideas. So I think about someone like Ida B. Wells, right, who always thought about the struggle as beyond the US, right? Even though her work was deeply engaged in what was happening in the US. But she was engaged by Garveyism, engaged by thinking about building with the darker races, right? Someone like Mary Church Terrell, even though she is seen as a sort of middle class club woman, was engaged in the ideas of class and transnationalism. And by the 50s is involved in the Civil Rights Congress doing some of that work, right? For me, the question is not so much whether it is or it isn't, but how do we build our genealogies and who do we hold up as framing Black feminism and then being and understanding their ideas. I once gave a talk and I was talking about class or politics and someone said, well, you just say Black feminism, but you don't say class politics. And I said, well, isn't that encapsulated in Black feminism? If I start with discussing, say, the Combahee River Collective, doesn't that mean already an analysis of class? I want, I guess, to create an intellectual debate where Black feminism holds those things and the differences are something. Beyonce gets pop Black feminism or something. She doesn't get Black feminism, right? That because I think that's what the genealogy that at least I see as building Black feminism, the thinkers, that's what they're engaging and building from.
So that's really great. Genealogy, history, also right. Like that's history right there. And I think that part of what's so important about the work that all of you are doing is to resurrect or to uplift the work that radical Black women have done since the 1930s and the 40s and the 50s, and to really bring that into view. And it does speak also to this point that Robyn made about trying to understand how people get to where they are. But I want to follow up on Charisse's point here, about this being a political and an ideological position, right? So you cannot simply label all Black feminists as transnational because they aren't all radical transnationalists. And I want to bring it actually up to the present a little bit. And we've seen over the past few years serious attacks on critical race theory and on DEI. And those are very, very different things, of course. DEI is kind of the liberal institutional version of racial politics, whereas critical race theory is, in fact, a critical framework. Oh, that was Siri. See, they're spying on us. I didn't even touch that. So critical race theory really does offer a critical analysis of institutionalized state power, of capitalism, of white supremacy. And so I guess I want to ask you, and I think you've sort of already answered this in your talks, but I just want to uplift it a little bit again, and that is what is really at stake in this debates around DEI and especially critical race theory. Because if we look at the books that have been taken off, for example, the College Board AP test for history in Florida, right? Most of those authors were radical Black women. It was Audre Lorde, it was Bell Hooks, it was Kimberly Crenshaw, it was Angela Davis, it was Keeanga Taylor, right? And so, what is so threatening? Who's afraid of radical Black feminism and why?
Great questions. Great questions. I guess I want to engage the provocation, not by, I don't want to downplay the dire moment that we're in at this moment. Well, there's that. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't mean to downplay the very real dire situation right now, and I'll talk about that as point number two. Point number one is I feel like there is something about this nomenclature. There's something about the ways in which our conversation is shaped and the parameters are governed by forces outside of our control, I would say. So before I launch into the DEI and the CRT, I want to uplift like the Combahee River Collective, which was mentioned earlier, and the very real tradition that we're talking about of radical women's activism. And I want to say that on the one hand, we need to know more about the Combahee River Collective. That is what's at stake in their erasure from the curriculum. On the other hand, we need to understand that there were other entities, right? I feel like we sometimes are so busy building a tradition that we're narrowing the people and the organizations and the scope instead of thinking about the broadening, right? How did ordinary people, teenage young women, welfare mothers, what did they contribute to the Black radical tradition that we need to know about? So on the one hand, I definitely agree that there sort of these attack on DEI, which is, again, it's a challenge because, I mean, it mutes our criticism of these things. We're deeply critical of these things, yet we have to now defend the thing that because the thing is under attack, and it's like, that's all we have. I want us to think bigger. I want us to imagine that there's a radical way of teaching US history, which is aligned with the true history of this country in terms of colonialism and genocide and hierarchy and power and movement, and that's a history that needs to be upheld, and that it's something to be preserved even beyond whatever the next attack on it is going to be, right? Whatever three initials will come, you know, we have to be ready, I think, to kind of uphold and not fight on the terms of people that are not even, that don't even have the best interest of anyone who's a critical thinker in mind. So I try to sidestep those conversations, not because those things are not happening. People are being fired. Teachers, if you follow Zen Education Project, which is doing amazing work with K to 12 teachers, I know that people's careers are on the line for simply mentioning, you know, the true history of the violence of this country. And we're not even talking about things like the labor movement. I mean, there's so much history that doesn't even get taught. I demand that history, and that's kind of where I want us to sort of stay. And yes, these attacks are part of the context that's framing us, but we can't just stay in that. That can't be the terms in which we engage the kind of history and the type of teaching that we want to see, you know, out there. So that's my non-answer answer.
I'm just going to say, no, that was great. That was great. And I just want to say very quickly, this is the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Combahee River Collective. And BCRW is organizing a Freedom School in the third week of May. And Robyn is actually curating that Freedom School. It's for undergraduate students, so you can reach out to us for more information about that.
That's excellent. I love this point that Robyn made, in the sense that I don't think DEI is the thing that we want to stand on, right? That in part, I approach it, I try to sustain this position that partly the attacks speak to the one's success, right? That the strength of Black feminists, radical women writing history, theorizing, creating space in the university to do work that's against the sort of frameworks of the university, I think that success produces pushback. And I think we're in a moment where we're seeing that. And so I try to hold that as I encounter these struggles. And I think the second thing is I love this idea that Robyn puts out, that we have to have a vision for what we want that isn't defined by what exists. And I think that is a way that I often try to think about the DEI issues, because I think some of the struggles, even if I don't agree with it, this person has not been an ally in the most important ways. On campuses, I might engage that struggle because I see it as an important stand to make, but also an opportunity to push for something more, right? That maybe in the destruction of DEI as it exists now, we can create something different. And I think that is sort of a moment idea I try to hold in my mind all the time. But I think the attacks on the scholarship is really an important, I mean, it is about sort of the fear that when people read this work, they think differently about the world, right? The fear that they will begin to understand how power operates and how capitalism is gendered and racialized and all these things that people say it's not, right? And that I think that is a powerful message that we have to continue to do, that should inspire us to continue to do the work and continue to lift up the scholars that are silenced and continue to create space for people who forces try to sort of isolate or silence. And I think that for me, that strives from the real attack on Black queer and feminist scholars, the attack on pro-Palestinian scholars, I think the attack on people who do anti-capitalist and socialist work, I think those are LGBT communities and trans communities, those are the spaces and the voices that we should create, we should welcome into the room more and more, because I think they're doing the work that is challenging the structures and exposing the ways that power is operating in these systems. And so that's what I'll say.
I think to that, I'll just add, I don't know why the analytical fear is always the one that we use, because I think that these people are vengeful, right? this is revanchism. So for those of us who are dialectical materialists, we know that this is not the first time that this has happened. It won't be the last. There was the clapback, if you will, to like multiculturalism. There was a clapback to the 1965 Education Act, which expanded higher education for racialized people and women. So there's always this sort of white supremacist ruling class revanchism. I think that what is very worrying is the anti-intellectualism of it, because if you look at two things, one is the anti-intellectualism, because if you look at the tools that are being used to attack DEI, a lot of it is this whole plagiarism accusation, which goes back to a number of tropes about Black people, that we're ignorant, right? That we don't deserve the positions that we have, and that higher education is abetting this, right? And so it's part of a broader anti-intellectual attack, which is meant to keep the population ignorant and repressed. I think the second thing is that we ought to be really concerned about is not what the object of the attack is per se, but the fact that these people are organized. They have out-organized us. The left, like radical Black feminists, Pan-Africanists, Marxists, all of us, they out-organize us. And everything is up for grabs, everything, right? So whether it's school boards, women's bodies, trans and LGBT rights, everything is up for grabs, and they're organized on all of those fronts, right? And so to Robyn's point, as we're defending things we don't care about, like AP African American Studies, when many of our children are functionally illiterate, that's not something that's important to us, but we're letting these people set our agenda instead of building our own institutions, instead of like doing the radical thing, right? We're defending diversity, equity, and inclusion, which, whatever, right? Fine. And so I think that is something that we really need to think deeply about. And that's what's really dangerous, is the level of organization at all levels of society, because these are also people who are in the military, they're in the police, they're in the government, they're in the schools, they're in civil society, they have all of these organizations. And so that to me is something that we really need to focus on. And critical race theory, that thing is really irrelevant in terms of what they're attacking, because it means everything and nothing, right? And then all of a sudden everybody's starting to show how their work does CRT and why it's so important. It's like, well, everybody's work doesn't do CRT. CRT is a very specific thing. Your work doesn't need to do CRT. And so I think we just keep on doing the work. We need to keep on doing the types of work that we do, but I also think we need to be organized, right? Because that's going to be the best defense against this onslaught that's only going to continue and only going to get more serious.
So thank you all for that. Brilliant responses, as I expected. I'm just going to ask one more question, and then we're going to open it up for those of you who might have questions in the audience. So I guess the logical question from your answers that you just gave me are, what lessons can we draw from the history of radical Black feminism for this moment? And I'm thinking in particular, you all talked about imperialism or war or internationalism in some way. And we are living in another moment of war. Well, I think we're in perpetual war in this country. But a particularly brutal war right now that we're supporting in Israel-Palestine, but not only there, right? And so in this moment where the stakes are so high, what kind of lessons can we draw from the radical Black feminist work of Black women who were involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement, Black women domestic workers who organized and managed to find a way out of no way to assert themselves and to develop a new political framework, or the We Charge Genocide campaign? Like, how can we think about what strategies we can use from the past to help us forge a new path forward?
I was just thinking that one of the lessons I draw from these people that I study is that they found their people and they organized. And they organized not just around one issue that was their favorite issue or in one organization, but multiple spaces because they saw them as interrelated, as interconnected, as needing to have the different voices and politics they were bringing. And they did it not just while they were in school or not just at a certain job, they did it for a lifetime. And I often draw the lesson about how you become a lifelong committed activist, because that is also a real skill. And I think the skill we need at these moments, because as the panelists have spoken, this is not this one moment where these struggles happen, right? That these are ongoing, right? That one victory doesn't ensure the victory the next time around. And so I think the biggest lesson I take from them is they found their people that not only they could organize with it, but help to sustain them, right? And that doesn't mean you don't have political differences and political struggle, but that means that you are sharing a sort of vision or working towards a vision for the world you want to live in and how to get there. And I carry that with me just all the time. And I'll just say this last thing because I was thinking about, I was walking around with a friend yesterday and they pointed to me the Ozzie Davis, Ruby D roads around here. And I can remember going to a Gulf War protest, must have been in some time ago in the 2000s. And I was going up to speak and Ozzie Davis was there. And I just thought to myself, what war protest number is this? What war is this that he's protesting, right? Because he was around during World War II and the Korean War and I just thought that right there is a model, right? Or, and I'll just give him one more problem. When I saw him on the L word, I don't know if this is dating me too, but I just thought, what does it mean for this Black man to be able to find all these spaces and do this work in all these different spaces? That is the sort of longevity that I think we all should work for. That at 85 or 90, we're on the stage at somewhere, at another protest in somewhere.
Thank you, Keeanga. That sounds tiring. I'm of the hope that transformation could be had in our lifetimes and that, you know, things are going to be transformed. I wanted to say that I want to talk about relationships. People don't highlight those enough. And it's not about hearts and minds and any woo woo and, no. I'm talking about like building um, uh, political connection with people, reading together, learning together, challenging each other. The kind of comradeship that was so common in the 60s where people were not quote unquote friends, right? You don't have to be everything that friends sort of suggest to you with its warrant, but you can be comrades, right? People who are united towards a particular political mission, people who are trying to organization build. Those are the things that seem to be missing. I feel like I think about what Pat Robinson did just in her neighborhood with her neighbors and her neighbors' children, just talking to young people, finding young people that, she could put Fanon into the hands of, right? Giving people dictionaries, right? Having these freedom schools where there was babysitting. These are some of the things to do when you feel helpless, like what else can I do and stuff. And sometimes you're in an organization that feels big. You might be just feel like you're a cog in the wheel of a larger entity. But then where is the local chapter? Where are the face-to-face relationships that you can build? What do you do when your feelings get hurt because your politics, you may not be so sharp on this particular part of it? How do you go back into the reading? I feel like there is that kind of anti-intellectualism where the ideal is that, we can't read, we have to be, and I love escapism and the reality TV thing, but that stuff has taken up a lot of our headspace. What is left? Where's the part of our life that we've set aside to do something about the atrocities of this world? That space is gone. We feel, and I'm going to say unpopularly, that also we have to talk about recreational drugs and the impact that's having on our ability to focus and to chart a path towards a liberatory future.
Um, I think this is on. Yeah. So interesting. So my second book project that I'm working on theoretically, I just had a baby, so I'm actually just working on keeping my baby alive. But it's harder than you think. No, I'm just kidding. My book is on it's called Mutual Comradeship, Love, Radical Responsibility, and Solidarity, and it's specifically about I talk about mutual comradeship as an ethical, epistemological, and political practice, right? So one thing, ethics is really important. How do we relate to ourselves? How do we relate to each other? And how do we relate to the work? I think is really important. How do we conduct ourselves and comport ourselves when we're in these organizations is really, really important. Something that falls by the wayside. Like there's this whole discourse thinking about we don't have to be friends to be comrades, but there's this discourse that you can like hate the people that are in these organizations, and that's just objectively false. You're not gonna put yourself at risk for somebody that you hate, right? And so, Che Guevara says, like, the revolutionary is led by profound feelings of love. I think that's really important, and not like arrows, right? Please don't go to organizations to find your boo. That's not the point. But I mean like love as radical responsibility, right? So ethics is important. Epistemology. So how is the world presented to us? How do we need to understand the world? How do we justify those beliefs? And how are the beliefs that are imposed upon us justified? So we have to have a fundamental rethinking. And then politics. How is it that we struggle for power? And so I came up with this theory of mutual comradeship, if you will, from these women, right? And I will say, like, people like Dayo, Gore, and Eric McDuffie, like, introduced me to this whole, it was their books that sort of presented me with these people. And then, I went on digging. Also, I wanted to say I am not a historian. I'm a Black Studies scholar. I'm just historically nosy. I think it's important to say that because I'm trained in Black Studies, and I think that's really important to say, especially if we're thinking about struggle. It is a discipline that came onto campus through struggle. The first, really, that then there was others that followed suit. But anyway, so I think we can learn how to ethically orient ourselves. I think we can learn how to wage struggle over epistemology. And then I think that politically we have to put power back on the table. Somehow power has fallen by the wayside. It's like, we matter and we're here. Yes, we are, and we do, but power is like really important, and it's something that we need if we're going to win. And that is the other thing, is that we will win, right? I wrote a book I edited this book, Organized Fight Win, because if we don't think we're gonna win, like, what's the point? And that's something that I learned from somebody like Louise Thompson Patterson, Esther Cooper Jackson, who were lifelong like organizers, activists, and theorists.
So I think there are mics. Yep. So you can raise your hand. And while we're waiting for somebody to raise their hand, I just want to say, all three of you talked about comradeship, about community, and about friendship to one degree or another. But of course, friendship is not the same as political solidarity. I think that's part of what you're saying, right? And so part of what we have to do is build political community and not just community, because I think there's a distinction. And part of that is about principled disagreement, which I think does not happen enough today, where we can say, I don't like what you're saying, but you're still my comrade, and I still love you, that love that you're talking about, Charisse. And so how can we move to that place where we can disagree with somebody vehemently, perhaps, but still consider them part of our political community?
Can I just say, friends are important, though, because one of the important.
Yes, I like friends.
Because alienation is a thing. Like, we are profoundly alienated as people, and so I don't want to discount friendships, but I think it is important to have that distinction, because like my friend Layla, we go everywhere together, and she's my comrade and my friend. We have a podcast with our political work, but like, friendship is important. Like, have your human connection. It lets you know you're still alive.
So please raise your hand if you have a question or comment, and somebody will come by.
Hello? Okay. This is purely selfish. And I'll first say thank you so much. I want to read everything you've ever read and everything you're going to write. So, yes. I am a community organizer and an activist. And queer Black feminist theorist scholar in my kitchen. And congratulations on 49 years. And I want to know who's not in the room, because I thought I was Black until 2003 when I moved to the US and found out I was South Asian. I grew up in the Caribbean to a very diverse family, been called Black all my life, been told I was too dark. And so I came and I went to an HBCU. Learned real fast that in America I'm not Black, right? And so a lot of the conversation around anti-colonialism and Black radicalism, I'm like, you're my people. I am here for you. And I want to hear how we challenge transnational feminism to talk about American imperialism in the Caribbean and South America. And so the selfish part is, when are we going to start reading this? Who wants to write it? I want to talk to you about it. And just sort of like, you've all brought up how we talk about epistemology and comradeship and relationship building and not using the frameworks that we are given. But I want to break all those frameworks and talk about the amazing Black people who've only come to the United States of America on survival and have become part of this rich Black feminist history taking and activist writing to challenge all of us to like seek more and seek more power. And I don't want them to be lost, because I personally selfishly want to learn about my people. And I just, I wanted to put that out there. I appreciate your work, but I just say, like, we can expand even more and break all those words. And Premilla, when you asked that question in the middle, like, what's at stake? I'm like, you could have kept that for the end, because I was like, everything is at stake right now. And so I love you all. And I just wanted to make that comment, but also ask about, how do we honor Black peoples? Because white people don't know the difference. We're all Black. How do we honor all of the Black people on this planet who have contributed and partnered and loved and married American and Black queer feminists? And it just, putting that out there.
Yeah, well, I think being even more specific, like, I think you mean like USian, right? So we don't want to overdetermine the Americas by the United States. But I think, so political Blackness is a thing, right? Political Blackness is real. And this is not like Dolezalin, right? This is not just people claiming to be real. But so something, I think, Robyn, you mentioned the Black woman. Grace Lee Boggs is in the Black woman. And she's not somebody who is, she's Asian American. But I think that that's important, because political Blackness is a thing. It's not reducible to African Americans or even African descent to a certain degree. I think there is a political and solidarity component to it. And I think we need both. And I do think that we need to lift up the work of US Black people. It's really important, and those institutions are really important. Many people came to HBCUs, for example, and that is where a long sort of Black radical and Black intellectual tradition is. But I don't think that I do think we need to push back against like Americocentrism in the ways that oftentimes when we talk about Black radicalism, we only focus on African Americans. And so I think that everybody needs to engage in that work. And also, I think a lot of more of those conversations happen outside of academia because of the makeup of Black organizations. There are Caribbean folks, Filipino folks, all this a panoply of racialized workers who identify as Black or who engage in what we might call political Blackness. So I think your point is really important. And I think even as we have particular foci, I don't think that we would push back or we would negate the fact that there are all sorts of other peoples who belong in this conversation. Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me? Yes? Okay, maybe it's an oversimplification, but about the whole dialectics about slave-master relationship. And the most important point in the dialectics is the fact when the slaves realize that the master cannot live without them. So my question to you is, when do we arrive to that point where they realize, the master or the masters, they realize that if a woman has to go to have an abortion 300 miles away, how do we get to that point, where the master realize, and the slaves realize that the master cannot live without them? That's the question.
I'm not a master, so I don't know.
That I mean, that gives a lot to kind of think about. You can go in many different directions with that. I'm going to take in the direction of power and us, the collective us, understanding our power. I think feeling disempowered, feeling hopeless is part of the manufacture that keeps us under the thumb of passivity. And I think that, yes, there has to be that mental shift. And for me as an educator, like I see it happening through education, right? What can happen in classrooms, all different kind of classrooms seems to be very, very important. And I think the question of relationality is also key. I mean, it brings me back to the other question about, I guess, the relationship to power, right? And solidarity. And we started with a land acknowledgement. Yet this idea that, what of Hawaii? What of Puerto Rico? I think when we think about Palestine, so many other things that should happen in any sort of political education. When you learn about one place, all of a sudden you'll see all of these connections that perhaps you only connected in, with a particular node, and you'll see like this whole connection. And that's why I study people's lives, right? To say the people that Dayo studies, that they traveled. And when they traveled, they refined their ideas because they went and realized America is in me. When I'm here and abroad, I'm here someplace else. So now I have to continually refine my own thinking. I have to go deeper. I'm not there yet. And I feel like there's always the feeling of, how do I politicize others, as if we're finished ourselves, right? But through travel, I think through understanding power, we can come to a different understanding. And it's always through organization.
I'll just say quickly too, I think one of the key problems, especially in this country, is we too often identify with the master. We have a profound celebrity culture, celebrity and influencerism culture, whereby people either think that they'll become the master, or they think that masters are the drivers of history, or that masters are our leaders. There's a one-to-one people draw between like wealth and leadership, or wealth and masters being those who are going to free us, when it's exactly the opposite. And so I think once we disidentify with the map and point out the real realities, that these are despicable, exploitative people who do not have our interest in mind, then I think that that's really key to understanding, to getting to that next understanding, that they then cannot survive without the exploitation and oppression that makes them masters, right?
I just will second that, because I think the structures of capitalism really enforce in us, even if as we resist against it, this sense that we make our own success, right? And this individualism. And I think things like the university, our intellectual traditions reinforce those ideas, right? So we talk about anti-intellectualism, but even some of our intellectual traditions reinforce this idea that you just have to be the smartest to come up with the best idea, this individualist frameworks that I think are hard to push back against and think about the collective power. This is why I often, and I love Robyn's reference to the classroom, because when I know I'm teaching my social movements class right, when the students start plotting against me, right? When they are like, Professor Gore, you say this paper is due here, but 5 of us have come up with an alternative plan. And then I'm like, excellent. I have done my work. You can have it, if you convince me of that, because I do think we get so few opportunities to find our power in the structures and the systems that we live in, and our collective power. And this is why I say organizing is important. Going to protests, even though, maybe you've been to, but having that feeling we're in a collective group of people, you have power, right? That you're all sharing one voice in some ways. And I think those are the moments that will allow us to see, to really get in touch as on a personal level with the power we can have in collective organizing.
I want to just quickly add. Thank you. One thing I'll just quickly add is that I feel like part of the history that they don't give us is that they give us this sort of segregated social movement history. We need to know about those radical white students who criticized institutions and the way in which society worked. And we need to know that history too. And I feel like when I say read and things like that, I'm not just talking about from the political tradition that we've discussed up here today. As I mentioned before, read about the radical labor movement in this country, read about the white left in this country, educate yourself so you can really understand, read about brown power, red power, right? All of those things are so, so important.
Just would add one more thing, because on this other point, I think particularly the traditions I write about, the Black radical tradition, owe so much to Black Caribbean folks, immigrants who came here, because that's sort of the foundations of a lot of the Black radical politics that developed. And you think about even as the movements developed, the ways in which these activists would go to Hawaii and then have a different analysis based on how they saw indigenous communities within the US living, right? And so I just wanted to acknowledge the ways in which I think when we read the histories, right, that we get to see the ways in which these ideas that we think aren't connected are actually in people's lived experiences. That's how they develop, right?
And I'm just kidding.
Y'all done? Yeah. No, we have a
Reserve the time.
we have a question over here, I think.
Oh, okay. Hello. Hi. Thank you all so much for your incredible work. It's been making me think the entire time I've been here. I think about some things that I see in organizations, and so much of what you all talked about has to do with how we organize. And so my question, I think, is really about kind of the schism that I see that maybe some other folks don't, but I feel like the schism that I see between some organizations and communities, and it's long, but I'll try to make it short. And so basically, like, how do you understand kind of academic verbalism, to put it in Paulo Freire's words, in a time of neoliberalism? For example, some calls to organize I've heard seem to be lacking in a call to deeply engage the form of capitalism we live under. And I think, like, to bring it back to Walter Rodney's work, Anti-Colonial Marxism, he invites, like, and in his case, he was talking about third world people, but I do think it can apply to everyone, to analyze the specific the form of capitalism that you live under. Keynesianism as we know, is entirely different from neoliberalism. Well, not entirely, but is very different from neoliberalism in many ways. And it seems like there are shifts that have come about in the way that people think, in the way that people are mediated, in the way that people are socialized, due to changes in the particular form of capitalism. And it seems to me sometimes, I am a part of an organization, and it seems like it functions a little bit differently in some ways than like the FLN did in the Algerian Revolution. I feel like it was there was both bringing people along and helping them make those connections to transnational imperial capitalism, and there was also community, like addressing community needs in the moment. And so sometimes it seems like there's a difference, that there's a shift, and that there can be a gap in the way that organizations are doing some of their work, in the way that masses of people understand what's happening. I think when I see discourse on social media, which is not the only thing that's going on, when I see discourse on social media, it seems it seems like people have a bit of a different understanding, I think, than even some of the things that we're talking about in this room, which, I mean, I would hope that more people knew about. I hope that more people are integrating into their perspectives. But it seems like there's something different. And so I guess I wanted to hear what you all think about that. Thank you.
Okay. I think, again, if you look at sort of the work that, so if you draw historically, for example, if we think about the Sojourners for Truth and Justice, which Dayo has written about, which I write about a little bit in my work, they're an organization that did localized work, for example, like organizing for the freedom of Rosalie Ingram, who is a Black woman sharecropper who was sent to prison for her and her son murdering like a white man that attacked them. That was a very localized form of organizing that they then made into sort of a national campaign and then also internationalized. But then they also did forms of internationalist work, like protesting the Korean War and helping to circulate the We Charge Genocide petition. And so this organization fundamentally understood you have to do both, and you have to satisfy the local material conditions, because so especially today we're so like people have been reduced to bare life, like everything is just about survival, whereby it's hard to develop a political consciousness beyond your everyday reality if you are simply trying to pay your rent, right? I'm choosing between paying your rent or getting medication or something, right? And so I think there's so many fronts on which we have to fight. Organizations often choose one or the other, and I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I think this is the point of coalitions, and this is the point of solidarity, is that there's something for everybody to do. I think that what's foundational to every organization is political education, because that is the so what. Why are you doing the thing that you're doing, right? Because the difference between mutual aid and charity is ostensibly the political education, the end that you're trying to build mass power. And so to me, we need all hands on deck. There's a lot that is very terrible. And so I think there's something for everybody to do, but then that's where coalitions come in and working and collectives of organizations, so we can cast a broader net, right? And so that everybody's not spread too thin.
I had a few things I wanted to add as well. Thank you for your comments. I mean, I think about the Panthers and the idea of survival pending revolution, and this idea of coming together to work together to meet material needs, but not becoming a bureaucracy whose sole purpose is to meet those needs. But how do we politicize others as we politicize ourselves in the provision of those needs? Like I said, we all, I think, are in a constant process of rethinking and rethinking and rethinking. That seems to be like one way out of what you're saying. I thought about the kitchen table that was mentioned earlier in the first question as a site of knowledge making. I think that people know more than we think they know. I think that strategizing how to make rent and make all the bills work in in the sense of scarcity and lack, and the creativity and underground ways that people survive. I do think that there is a foundation on which to build a sense of exploitation, and people understand that. People understand more than we think. They understand more than we think, more than we know, right? Because many of us in this room are not juggling those, horrific priorities and things like that. So I guess really thinking about where knowledge is coming from. And you mentioned Walter Rodney, of course, the ideal of groundings and thinking about education in a way that is doesn't just create a master teacher, but is also rotating constantly student teacher, so that people are in constantly learning. All of that seems to be really clear. I'll say that I taught my daughter about capitalism through the Shark Tank. It's pretty clear, right? I mean, I think that a child could understand what's happening here in terms of how exploitation works. Of course, it's so much more complicated than that, but it's also not, right? So we have to think about how we are simplifying. I mentioned that Patricia Robinson gave people dictionaries. She didn't tell people to shy away from the hard reading, the theoretical reading. She just gave them the tools and showed them how it connected to their lived experiences and walked alongside of them, constantly questioning herself and her class reality as she did that. And I think that's something that we can all do.
So we are sadly out of time, but very happily, this is the very beginning of our conference, and we will all be here tomorrow with another amazing set of panels, 9:30 in the morning. We will have coffee, don't worry. So I look forward to seeing all of you then, and have a good evening.